Welcome to the start of our third unit in pre-cal. We're going to be starting with a few units from chapter 5. The first one is the composite functions. So composition functions, if you're given two functions f and g, the composition function denoted by f and then this little circle g, which you read as f composed with g, or f of g, is defined by, so f of g of x is the same thing as saying f of g of x. And this means that x is plugged into g. The output of this is then plugged into f. So the domain of f composed with g is the set of all numbers x in the domain of g, that g of x is within the domain of f. That sounds like a lot of stuff. So first what we've got to see is what x's does g allow? So what is the domain of g of x? And then once we've composed them, what is the domain of the composition function? So we'll do a couple of these so you can see. It's really easier than it sounds. But before we start on this example, what is the domain of f of x in this problem? Well, it's a quadratic, so our domain is all real numbers. You can square any number. G of x is a cubic. We can cube any number, so the domain of that is all real numbers. Okay, that's great to know. What we want to know is f composed with g of 1. So that means that's f of g of 1. I'm going to take the number 1, plug it into g of x, and then plug that answer into f. So g of x says take whatever you have, cube it, plus 1. So again, I'm just taking it right from here. I'm putting a 1 in place of the x. Before I go any further, I need to evaluate this to see what this is. 1 cubed is 1, times 4 is 4, plus 1 is 5. So now the output of g of 1 is 5. 5 is now the input into function f. So I'm going to put a 5 in place of the x in this function. So 2 times 5 squared plus 3. 5 squared is 25, times 2 is 50, plus 3. It just gives us a 53. So f composed with g of 1 is equal to 53. Part B, we are going to say g composed with f of 1. And again, the order matters here. So this is the same as g of f of 1, meaning I'm putting the 1 into function f. The output from this I will then put into g. So notice I'm leaving the g here. I'm putting a 1 now into function f. So that's going to be 2 times 1 squared plus 3. Okay, we've got to evaluate it. 1 squared is 1, times 2 is 2, plus 3 is 5. Okay, so I've got g of 5 now. I'm putting the 5 into function g. So that's function g says 4 times whatever you are inputting, cubed, plus 1. Let's see, 5 cubed is 125, times 4 is 500, plus 1 is 501. So g of f of 1 is equal to 501. Now look, we can compose functions with themselves. So what this means is I'm going to take negative 2, I'm going to plug it into function f. The output of this I'm then going to put back into function f again. So function f says take whatever you're given, which in this case is 2, square it, multiply by 2, and add 3. 2 squared is 4, times 2 is 8, plus 3 gives me 11. So now I'm going to put 11 into function f. And again, function f says take whatever you're given, square it, multiply that answer by 2, and add 3. 11 squared is 121, times 2 is 242, plus 3 gives me 245. Okay, and again, feel free to use the calculator to do this math if you need it. Here we've got g composed with g of negative 1. So I'm putting a negative 1 into g. That output I'm going to put back into g. So let's see what this looks like. G says take whatever you're given, cube it, multiply by 4, and add 1. So if I'm putting in a negative 1, it's going to be negative 1 cubed times 4 plus 1. So let's see, negative 1 cubed is still negative. Times 4 is negative 4 plus 1 gives me a negative 3. So I'm now going to take this negative 3 and plug it into G, which says 4 times whatever you're given, in this case a negative 3, cubed plus 1. Negative 3 cubed is negative 27, times 4 is negative 108, plus 1 is negative 107. So G of negative 1 is negative 107. Okay, not too bad, I hope. Again, you start on the inside, or the first function, and work your way outward. Okay, so here we've got a new example. F of x is going to be this, and g of x is this. Okay, let's again look at what is our domain of each of these. We actually didn't use it in that first problem, but we will use it here. So a quadratic, so my domain for f of x is all real numbers. Here's a linear equation. Well, linear equations, the domain is all real numbers. So both of these, the domain is all real numbers. It does not have to remain that way when we compose them together. So we have to check and see what happens here. Okay, f of g of x, or f composed with g of x. So g of x simply says take whatever you're given, multiply by 4, and add 1. So I'm going to rewrite this as f of 4x plus 1. So now this 4x plus 1 is the input into function f. Wherever function f has an x, because that just represents your input, I'm going to put 4x plus 1, or replace the x with the 4x plus 1. So this equals 2 times the input, so 4x plus 1 squared, minus the input, so 4x plus 1, plus 4. Okay, so again, step by step, first thing we need to do here is let's go ahead and multiply out 4x plus 1 times 4x plus 1, because it's squared. And when we do that, that gives us 16x squared plus 8x plus 1. And again, go ahead and do that multiplication yourself to make sure you understand how I got that. We're going to distribute the negative to both things in the parentheses, so negative 4x minus 1, and I still have that plus 4 hanging out. Okay, I've got to distribute the 2 to everything inside the parentheses, so that's going to give me 32x squared plus 16x plus 2 minus 4x, and I'm going to go ahead and combine the negative 1 and 4 while I can, so that's a plus 3. And finally, let's combine all like terms. So we've got 32x squared, 16x minus 4x is 12x, 2 plus 3 gives me 5. Okay, so if I want to set up my domain now, it's going to be all the numbers from g of x, so that was all real numbers. So that is all real numbers. And then we also have to look at f of g of x. What is the domain of this, what we finished with? That's another quadratic. So the domain is still going to be all real numbers here. So it's the set of all x's such that x is an element of all real numbers, because both g of x is all real numbers and the composed function, the domain, is all real numbers. So those give us just all real numbers. Not very exciting. Okay, here we're going to do it in the reverse order. This says g composed with f of x. So again, this means we're going to take f of x, and that's going to be the input into g. So f of x is 2x squared minus x plus 4. I'm going to put all of this now into g of x. So wherever there was an x in my function g, I'm now going to be putting all of this. So this looks like 4 times my input plus 1. So again, what's in the parentheses is what was the x right here. Let's distribute this. We get 8x squared minus 4x plus 16 plus 1. Combine these together and we get 8x squared minus 4x plus 17. So that is g of f of x. Our domain, the domain of f of x was all real numbers. The domain of g of f of x is all real numbers. So my domain is still all real numbers here. Let's go on to the next video now.